I'd like to start by recognising that here on Sovereign Hill we gather on Wathaurong land. The Wathaurong and their forebears have been custodians of this place for many tens of thousands of years. They have performed ceremonies, celebration, initiations, renewal, have come together to reform bonds and to celebrate culture. We acknowledge that living culture and their unique role in the life of this region. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I pay my respects to any Aboriginal people who are with us tonight. I'd like to ask anybody who has a hearing impairment perhaps to make themselves known. We have some interpreters here with us this evening, and if you'd like to make your way to a space where you have good visibility of the interpreters, thank you, Jan, just put up your hand, but we can make some space to the front so that you have comfort in sharing this experience with all of us. I'd like to, as I said, welcome you to a really special place, and I'd like to particularly welcome some of the special guests we have with us this evening. We have Sovereign Hill Museums Association board members Anne-Marie Perry and Adrian Doyle with us tonight, and our Chief Executive Officer, Sarah Kwan. We also have the Bate family, and a special thanks to you for joining us here tonight. I'd like to introduce Paul and Pauline, our interpreters, who will be with us this evening. I'd like to welcome our guest lecturer, Dr. Sarah Hayes, and her family. And I'd like to start by inviting you to share a moment that really brings forth the power of music and emotional experiences to connect us to stories of the past by inviting a few performers up. Sarah will be talking to us this evening about objects and how they can evoke and connect us to the past and evoke emotions that are important to us. And just as objects can evoke those emotions, so can song. Music is a really powerful stimulant. And we're going to hear two songs tonight performed by one of Sovereign Hill's own interpreters, Rebecca Callahan, accompanied by Vicky Rowe on piano. And these songs were arranged and chosen for us by Dr. Terence Fitzsimons, who is an honorary historian with Sovereign Hill and one of the people we work with to bring this experience for you. Both of these songs were written by Henry Russell, a popular 19th century composer, now largely forgotten or perhaps discarded, as we'll talk about a little later on. So I'd like to invite Rebecca and Vicky to the stage. Thank you.
Treasured
thank you so much, Rebecca and Vicky, for that experience of the intangible heritage that this organisation cares for, those experiences that connect us to the past and evoke this really strong sense of nostalgia. It's not just about the experience and the environment that is created here for you, but how we live with that and connect to the experiences that people have always enjoyed through time. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Sarah Hayes, our guest lecturer. Sarah is an archaeologist exploring life in Victorian cities through the study of discarded possessions, building remains and personal histories. Sarah is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University, co-editor of the Australasian Society for Historical Archaeology, a journal, and member of the Heritage Council's Archaeology and Underwater Cultural Heritage Committee. Tonight, Dr. Hayes will be speaking to us about the gold rush in discarded things. So I invite Sarah to join us.
Everyone, and thank you so much for coming out and braving the rain. I hope you mostly missed it on the way here, and with any luck it won't start up again. Thank you so much to the Bate family for having me here for this lecture. It's so exciting for me. I'm really very lucky and privileged to have been invited. I also wanted to echo the welcome to country and just acknowledge the Aboriginal people who lived on the various lands that my research is based on around Bendigo and Melbourne. And I'll just quickly say hi to my dad and my kids up in the back there. I came to Sovereign Hill as a kid, as probably as many Australians did. I grew up in Adelaide, but my dad was really passionate about Australian history, and we made a family trip here when I was a little girl. And I'd say it was one really important factor in my career path. Not necessarily the most sensible and wise career path, but it seems to have worked out okay so far, which I'm very happy about. So I'll head into the topic for the evening, which is about the gold rush and the way that people were using things in this era and in discarded possessions, more or less. But I wanted to kind of bring you a bit closer, a bit more recent times before launching into some of that older gold rush era stuff. If I say to you, citywide mass decluttering event, you might think of February this year when Marie Kondo's Tidying Up aired on Netflix. I binge watched it, as you do, and immediately after this show aired, charities everywhere from Melbourne to Brisbane to New York were absolutely inundated by donations. So I have to remember that I've got slides, and hopefully that'll work. There's always something, isn't there? It was working before when we tested it. I imagine it has an on switch somewhere, but I cannot see it. Oh no, there we go. I found the on switch. Good. Excellent. Phew. Sorry about that. So it was a huge thing and global kind of thing. But what I tend to think of when I think about about a decluttering event is actually the one that took place in Melbourne and Bendigo in 1871 and 1872. Who would have thought of that? You see, cesspits, or long drop toilets, for those of you who aren't lucky enough to be familiar with cesspits, had become drastically problematic in Melbourne and Bendigo and Ballarat in this era. They were seeping into the groundwater. Every time it rained, sewage would be running down the streets and into people's cellars. Not really what you want. So the Inspector of Nuisances, isn't that the best name? Inspector of Nuisances, was making his way, he had a real name, but I can't bring myself to use it. Inspector of Nuisances is so much better. He was making his way around Melbourne, issuing cesspit closure notices, and the process was a bit different in Bendigo and Ballarat. But basically, people were given 2 weeks to fill these holes in the ground with all their rubbish, they had to fill it with clean fill, but no one wanted to pay the council for clean fill, so they used their excess rubbish. And I've just realised I forgot to start a timer, which is... Anyway, I'll have to rely on... Maybe Jan can yell at me. so people took this opportunity to throw out excess stuff that they had lying around. And the archaeology across the cities shows that no one, and I mean literally no one, regardless of background or income, had any trouble at all filling these pits to the brim with excess rubbish. And so we have things like plates, bottles, glasses, toys, jewellery, all sorts of things. A wedding ring is a notable one. So that's in spite of the fact that there was a weekly rubbish collection at this time. So every week a certain amount of rubbish got taken away. And in spite of that, people had more than enough stuff to fill the pits. So excess goods were clearly a problem. The Carlton Gardens, interestingly, was basically filled with rubbish. So before the gardens were put in, opportunistic residents and lazy night cart men were basically just dumping the rubbish in the Carlton Gardens before they planted it out. And archaeologists who excavated there found a full metre of rubbish across the Carlton Gardens. So wastefulness was clearly a problem. You would think that in this early era of mass production, things shipped to the other side of the world would have value and not be discarded, that they'd get reused or resold. But this wasn't the case. Cesspits across Melbourne have yielded plenty of complete bottles, even though there was a bottle washing factory just around the corner. So people were just throwing these things out anyway. It's a bit like, I imagine people still today are throwing stuff in landfill bins when they should really be going in the recycle bin. So I don't know if this was a stigma or laziness, maybe. It's probably laziness really, isn't it? But another interesting thing is that wealthier people were throwing out whole sets of ceramics that were still perfectly good and usable, purely because they'd gone out of fashion. So updating fashions even with things like tableware. So all of this means that beneath the skyscrapers, roads and public spaces, Victoria's cities are honeycombed with rubbish bits. And of course, for someone like me, that means that everywhere there are archaeological time capsules just waiting to be excavated. But it also speaks, I think, to this enduring culture of waste and the snowballing of the problems that are related with it. Does it work? Oh, look, I forgot to show you the one of the cesspit. That's a cesspit being excavated in Melbourne and all the rubbish coming out of it. So if all this waste from the gold rush era is still sitting there below our cities, so too our contemporary landfills will still be there in 150 years' time. Even longer. This stuff just doesn't degrade, any of it. It's not just plastics, it's glass, ceramics, none of it degrades. So even though landfills are out of sight, it's easy to throw, and it's so easy to throw things away and have them just vanish. There's really no such thing as thrown away, it's just gone somewhere else. So it's a kind of a depressing situation, and landfills are obviously problematic. And I think archaeology has a role to play here in that it's unique in its careful study of the rubbish of individual people. It has something to contribute to understanding human behaviour and our current situation, because in the modern era we just don't get a chance to look at the rubbish that individuals throw away and interrogate the reasons why they've thrown that thing away. So it kind of gives us an opportunity to study human behaviour. So I just wanted to kind of qualify a bit. I'm not an excavating archaeologist. I'm more of an artefact cataloguing archaeologist, so I don't get to go out and do glamorous fieldwork and that kind of thing. My research looks a whole lot more like this. This gives me great satisfaction. It's all very neat and tidy. I basically work with what are called legacy collections, so collections that have been excavated by cultural heritage management projects and have then been put in storage, usually at Heritage Victoria or Museum Victoria. A lot of the time there's not enough resources to really interrogate and look at that material, and so that's kind of where a lot of my work has come in, is to try and go back to those collections and see what sort of histories and meanings there might be in those, hidden in all those boxes. So really, I'm looking at any and all records on material things and how people use them. So what I want to do today is to use this research on legacy collections to argue that the European discovery gold in Victoria changed consumer culture here permanently. To do this, it's important to understand how fraught it was to carve out a place in Victoria's cities, and how this went hand in hand with the elevation and heightened valuing of things and consumerism. By starting with the things that people discarded, I think it gives a unique vantage point on the gold rush. It's really an intimate look at people's lives. You know, what you throw out is kind of, you wouldn't want anyone to look at it, would you really? But I think the other thing to note about archaeology is it's very opportunistic. It depends on where you get to excavate, where development happens that enables that. And so it kind of leads to stories you wouldn't perhaps normally find. And I think that's one of the things that I find so compelling about archaeology. So all of this means that what I've been really looking at is how a whole range of people fared in Victoria's gold rush cities, with a real emphasis on the role that consumer goods played. In many ways, this approach, in that it's focusing on individuals, has similarities to the micro-local histories so successfully undertaken by Weston Bate. And in some ways, this is like an archaeological take on that research. So I want to use this style of research today to perhaps push back a little bit against the idea of the gold rush as the great democratic equaliser. This may have been very much the case for some for a time immediately after the start of the gold rush, but it wasn't the case for everybody. There were some great opportunities, but it wasn't evenly handed out. So from here on, I'm really going to be delving into a few stories, and I do hope that I have time to get to all of them. So the first story I really have is about the quite astonishing tale of gold rush opportunity and the type of person who could access it. So this bloke, I don't know how many of you will recognise him. So this is actually Mayor John Thomas Smith. He's barely remembered in spite of the fact that he was Mayor of Melbourne he became Mayor of Melbourne shortly after the start of the gold rush in 1851. He had a meteoric rise from his convict heritage, basically. So he's the son of a convict shoemaker, and his mother was also the daughter of convicts. But, you know, he somehow becomes Mayor of Melbourne, which is kind of crazy, I think. But he's been largely forgotten, and he doesn't, like, people who are deep in gold rush histories have never heard of him. I find him an interesting character. He was very, very harshly criticised by the Argus, and I think a lot of the histories have picked up on that. But he was also, and picked up on things like, you know, his slight scruffiness and his marriage to the Irish Catholic Ellen Pender, which, you know, put him beyond the pale of society, because he was Church of England. You can't, you know, that was a big deal back then. But John Thomas Smith was very determined, and he was obviously very intelligent and capable. He was also very charitable. He established a benevolent asylum. Also, interestingly, one of his first successful enterprises in Melbourne was running a theatre, the Queen's Theatre, which looked pretty similar to the one we're in tonight. But there was a great need for men like him in Victoria. There was a sort of short supply of people who were really able to take on those founding father type of roles. You know, he was at least English and Church of England, so that gave him an opportunity to leverage that. And he could kind of successfully conceal his convict past. And people speculated about it, but basically no one really pushed too hard, and it was okay. So in the absence of social connections and a family claim to status, the Smiths really turned to things to build and convey their wealth and position and hide the convict stain. So if you look at their rubbish, a lot of it is really flashy, like much more colourful, much more fancy. There's quite expensive things. But what's really interesting about the expensive things is that they're flawed. They have noticeable errors and mistakes in the way that the decorations have been applied. And it really speaks to the fact that they were buying into a lot of the ideas and the flashiness of consumer goods at this point, but they were trying to save money and not, you know, they didn't want to throw away too much money on stuff. So they were buying cheap seconds. It looks as good, it looks the part. If you don't look too closely, it's okay. And then it gets really interesting because their house is a bit different. They had this is their house, this is where the rubbish was excavated from, the cesspit in the back of this house. So it was a Georgian house, and Georgian architecture is out of date by the time Melbourne's established. You don't, you know, this is one of the only two Georgian buildings in Melbourne. And it kind of speaks to this desire to give this illusion of being from old money, you know, like they're trying to pass themselves off as something that they're really not, I suppose. So I find that kind of, it's an interesting kind of mix of things going on. Also, John Thomas Smith was known for his dapper appearance, but at the same time there was always a bit of a tone of mockery in the newspapers, implying that he was getting above himself in his showy approximation of this regal appearance. His white top hat set him apart, this tall white top hat, and it expressed his wealth and power, along with, I think, his lack of interest in conformity. If he wanted to pass himself off as a true Melbourne gentry guy, he wouldn't have chosen a white top hat. So I think the Smiths were really enjoying their wealth and position, but not necessarily trying to be the same as Melbourne's gentry. So some of those genteel ideas of restraint and, you know, not wasting money and being a bit, you know, demure and all those sorts of things kind of went out the window as more and more people became more like the Smiths and really bought into this kind of flashy sort of value of goods. And, you know, those people outnumbered the gentry, and so that became a much more influential model of consumerism, I suppose. I just want to quickly flag too that John Thomas Smith's status didn't extend to Ellen, his wife, at all, really. Because she was Irish Catholic, she couldn't get rid of that stain here. And one of the kind of sad things, I think, that you can pick up in the rubbish tip and the rubbish that they threw away is that they were investing a lot in the flashy tableware because they had to dine with the, you know, influential people of Melbourne. But if you look at the teaware, it's really plain, it's really basic. It looks like a working class, kind of poorer person's set of teaware. And I think that's probably because Ellen wasn't part of that Melbourne society sort of social circle of paying calls and taking tea with the women. So it would seem that she was very much excluded from that. Okay, so I'm going to move sort of to a slightly different end of the social spectrum here and start talking about two neighbours in the working class neighbourhood of Littlelon. So these are Melbourne's famous laneways, you know. Everyone knows and loves Melbourne's famous laneways. This is what they used to be like. So the neighbours in Littlelon were the Irish Catholic Maloney siblings and the nearby Cornwall family who ran a butcher shop. So their class and backgrounds were really on par with the Smiths, but they didn't have the convict saying. So arguably they were actually probably, in terms of background, a little bit higher up. But interestingly, they don't have anywhere near that level of success. And part of this, I think, is because they're a younger generation. They're about a decade younger than John Thomas Smith. And they were, you know, they arrived really among the countless other people who arrived on these shores shortly after the start of the gold rush. So John Thomas Smith was already here and benefited from the gold rush, whereas these people are arriving after the gold rush starts. So the Maloney siblings, who were all in their 20s, they made the passage in waves. So when the family could afford to send someone out, they sent someone out, and then gradually they moved through all the siblings until they'd all migrated out to Melbourne. They all moved into Littlelon and were part of a really strong Irish Catholic community there. So Margaret, Hannah and Edward all lived with John at various times, and their brother Thomas lived across the lane. So a couple of years ago, we put the entire contents of their cesspit on display in the foyer of Melbourne Museum, which was kind of awesome. So that's everything. So that's what they had ready to chuck out in a 2-week period. So, you know, that's nowhere near all the things they owned. That's just what they had ready and available to throw out in 2 weeks. So they have some fancy things in there too, some vases and some like Staffordshire figurines and all these sort of quite nice fancy things. So they're obviously really tapping into, you know, consumer culture and really like their stuff. And like the Smiths, they also used the seconds market. They were buying flawed items. So this teacup here, if you can kind of see in that rim, on the internal rim there's some heavy glaze runs, which would have meant that this wasn't sold at full price. So although the Maloney's houses in Littlelon were humble, it's possible that their homes and their capacity to consume represent a significant improvement in lifestyle and from the abject poverty that they'd left in Ireland. John stayed at the cottage until his death, and Margaret had returned to care for him. But she also stayed in Little Lon for the rest of her life. So even though they might have been able to move out of Little Lon, they chose to stay there. And I'd say that was largely because of the community that surrounded them. So their neighbours now, the Cornwalls. So Henry and Isabella Cornwall, they ran a butcher shop in Little Lon for 3 decades. At first they have a three-room little shop where they're running the butcher shop. They've got 6 children and a baby. Imagine what that would have been like in summer. Oh, three rooms, all the carcasses hanging out the backyard. It would just been awful. So in 1873, they managed to obviously build enough capital to move next door to a house with 7 rooms. It must have just been such a relief. But interestingly, the things in their rubbish pit are really basic, like super basic. They've got the most simple sets of ceramics. They're not really buying any French champagne or anything. And it's all really, really simple. They had maybe slightly nicer teaware. And something I find really interesting is even though they had those 7 children, there are no toys, no marbles, nothing, which is really unusual. And I think in many ways this is because they were putting everything into property. They were trying to buy property. They were trying to improve the place they were living in rather than buying material goods. So it's quite a contrast to their neighbours, the Maloneys. Excuse me. So they also moved out of Little Lon to Northcote. After Isabella's death, Henry was in his 60s when this happened. And he built these in the end, he builds these quite lovely cottages on High Street in Westgarth in Northcote. But what I find really crazy about this is he leaves them to his second wife, not to his children. So these poor kids, they had no toys and now they end up with no properties either. I feel like, I'm not sure what Henry Cornwall was on about, but yeah. I'm not sure that it was his kids. So their stories, along with the histories we've generated for over 100 Little Lon residents in the Gold Rush era, suggest how difficult it was to make your way up in the world. Of all of these people, John Maloney was the only one who made it to the goldfields out of 100 people living in this area. And these are all people that are arriving in 1851 and 1852, basically. And he comes to the goldfields, he finds gold, and what does he do? He goes back to Little Lon and buys the cottage they were renting. So, that's the kind of success we're talking about in Gold Rush era Victoria. It's not as glamorous and exciting as often you feel like it was. And Henry Cornwall, out of those 100 people, again, he's the only one to move to the suburbs, which has an associated idea of moving into the middle class. And I think the other thing just to quickly note is that the Maloneys and Cornwalls employed very different strategies in their quest for a better life. Property. It was kind of two very different strategies for a similar end. So I'm going to move to Bendigo now and have a bit of a look at what's happening in Bendigo. And also a little bit about women as business operators. Amelia Turner, she's the person who's, sorry, probably should have left that bit out. In 1857 in Ravenswood, in a remote Victorian, which is a remote Victorian town, probably many of you know it, Amelia Turner was still in her 30s and she lost her husband and her job at the same time. She'd been running a pub with her husband, and if you had to be a man to have a licence. So as soon as he died, she lost the licence, lost her job. She and John had married in Birmingham in 1851 and migrated together to Victoria the year after. So she's now alone, she doesn't have any kids, she's lost her husband. What she managed to do is find a job at the Royal Hotel in Bendigo, or Sandhurst as it was then. She quickly became the manager and quite influential in the operation of the hotel. Conveniently, the hotel owner died in 1866, so with some skillful manoeuvring, Amelia managed to secure the licence at this point, and she was living in the hotel. So she was kind of able to do that in Bendigo. Eventually, she bought both the hotel and a home at Kangaroo Flat. I'd say she was pretty plucky to kind of carve out this life in the Gold Rush era. And I think part of her success is in how she kitted out her pub with fancy goods. And if we look in Amelia's pub rubbish, so there's a great big rubbish pit in the back of her pub, we see some really quite exceptional fancy glassware. So a lot of this, that's her pub, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's really a very simple hotel. It's really basic. It's nothing like the fancy kind of pubs that you think of in Gold Rush era. But if you go inside, you get this kind of stuff. Whole lots of perfectly matching decorative glass, green glass, all these fancy things. I did some work some years ago on the Glenrowan Inn, the famous Ned Kelly Siege Inn, and it's really simple, pewters, nothing fancy at all. So this is next level. This is really fancy inside and not at all what the outside would imply. She also had plenty of nice ceramics for her dinner guests and also for the accommodation that was in the hotel. So you can see that Amelia Turner is really drawing on this new culture of things to attract the desired clientele to her pub, in spite of the fact that the pub building itself was not so grand. How am I going for time? When do I need to finish? Do I need to finish at 1:45? Is that what I'm aiming for? Or? Okay. 7 o'clock. Oh gosh, I can just keep going on and on. Excellent. In that case, I will tell you the story about Alicia Bond. She was a resident of Littlelon as well, so flipping back to Melbourne, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of that stuff about women as business operators first. She also utilised refined goods, but in a slightly different business. So before I head into that, I just want to kind of qualify this and say in the Gold Rush era, widowhood, wife desertion and single motherhood were really common. It happened all the time, you know, women being abandoned when their husbands went to the goldfields, a whole range of reasons. And of course there was no welfare state, you couldn't get any support from the government. Also, a lot of these women had no family here. They were on the opposite side of the world to the grandparents. There was no one here, no childcare. So very few options for employment, and the other kicker here is that if you had kids, that excluded you from even more jobs. So just so few options. And so hopefully you will feel slightly sympathetic when I tell you that Alicia Bond, who was an Irish widow, she first came to public notice in 1862 when she was reported as running a disreputable house, which is a brothel, essentially, in Melbourne. Her de facto husband, William Bond, had been attacked by her son from a previous marriage. And evidence at the trial revealed that her husband barely worked. And she testifies at the trial that she could not see her children starve and had at first taken in washing and then had to keep a brothel to support her family. That's really the classic story of 19th century sex work. After her de facto husband died of tuberculosis in 1863, Mrs. Bond starts accumulating assets. Women could be property owners at this time, so she starts accumulating assets. She has 3 houses, so she rents 2 to sex workers, and a third she runs a grocery shop and also a brothel upstairs. She's kind of spreading, hedging her bets and doing a mix of things, so it's very strategic. And what's interesting when you look at her rubbish is that you can kind of see again that same strategy that Amelia Turner had at her pub of buying into this world of goods and using kind of nice middle class sort of looking ceramics and goods to kind of convey the environment for her clientele, because that's what they're familiar with, largely middle class clientele, particularly for this brothel. So we have 77 French champagne bottles, which is lovely, lots of imported spirits, 300 oyster shells, lots of nice ceramics and gaming items, absinthe bottles, which is that, you know, the Green Fairy, the hallucinogenic thing that was at the height of popularity in this era. So it's like an entertainment venue as much as anything, and the entertainment aspect of things was also really important. One way or another, it was a very successful business enterprise, and she built quite a property portfolio in the end, so she buys more and more properties. So she ends up being a very wealthy woman, and, you know, there's a lot of business nous and success that's implied in that, even though we tend to overlook that because of the associations with sex work. Other things that came out of a rubbish pit in the backyard of this property are things like toothbrushes, jewellery, cosmetic pestles, medicine bottles and ointment jars and these sorts of things. And I really feel like these things remind you that these were women. They were people who were just trying to get by and trying to make a living as best they could. Toothbrushes. I mean, you know, how evocative is a toothbrush of someone's daily life? So I find these a really poignant reminder, and these stories and objects really lead us to a more personal look at lives for women in this era. I hope I don't run out of time, but I have to say this because we're in a theatre. Theatres like this were where a lot of the women plied their trade. The vestibules of theatres were one of the main places that women made business arrangements, let's say. And I think then that reveals to you just how incorporated in society they really were. They were in these theatres with the rest of society watching these shows, and a lot of the time they were the ones with the latest fashions from Paris, and they were the ones who were really kind of at the forefront of fashion and leading the way in many ways for this kind of culture of materialism, things and flashiness and showiness that was going on in the Gold Rush era. All right, so I'm going to flip now to something slightly less place-based, and I'll explain to you why that is in a minute. So you may have already spotted that a common thread through some of these stories is that the experiences of Irish Catholic people in Victoria. Discrimination followed them across the globe here, and it was something that they couldn't really shake that successfully. Like gender, cultural and ethnic background was a significant factor in the successes that were possible for people in Victoria. You know, John Thomas Smith was fine because he was English, he had that background, so it was a little bit easier for him. He was Church of England, those sorts of things. So as an archaeologist, my research really starts with places and the artefacts that are recovered from them. Of all the places that have been part of my research, there are only really two very ephemeral traces of Indigenous Victorians. The first is a very, very brief mention of a half-Aboriginal girl working as a domestic servant in one of the brothels. So she wasn't a sex worker, she was working as a domestic servant there. And the other is a stone tool recovered from Viewbank Homestead on the outskirts of Melbourne. So that's the only two things I've found. So the archaeological silence can be just as loud as the historical one. So there's kind of one material culture exception to this, maybe, which is worked glass artefacts that were found on Dja Dja Wurrung lands around Bendigo. So I have to flip it over, don't I? There you go. So access to traditional materials was really dwindling in this period, and access to lands, and it was getting harder and harder for Aboriginal people. So they expanded their techniques to European materials, and these artefacts were on display at the Old Treasury building last year, and they were contributed by the Dja Dja Wurrung Corporation. So it was an exhibition I was involved in, and I kind of knew about this and managed to get that involved in the exhibition. And it was the Dja Dja Wurrung really wanted to tell that as a kind of story of adaptation and resilience. Cultural heritage researcher Dennis Byrne highlights the difficulty of detecting the archaeology of Aboriginal people as they increasingly adapted European material culture, teacups and spoons, hammers and nails. Byrne highlights that while the materials are not Aboriginal themselves, there is an assumption that the distribution pattern of the objects at an archaeological site will reflect behavioural patterns that will be distinctively Aboriginal, meaning that they will be visible. But this may well not be the case for a range of reasons, and I think it's a bit of a cautionary tale there. So as a result of this kind of conundrum, the half-Aboriginal girl working as a domestic servant in Littlelon, she's invisible really. There's no trace archaeologically, and her name isn't recorded anywhere in history apart from this fleeting mention that we have. So Aboriginal culture and the relationship with both traditional materials and European goods was really changing and evolving. Byrne further argues that European settlers, slightly worried about time, I might skip that bit and talk to you instead about this issue of begging or exchange for Aboriginal people. The steady influx of Aboriginal people to Melbourne wasn't necessarily voluntary. As land and water sources were increasingly lost to white settlers, Aboriginal people, not just from the local clans, but from all over Victoria, were really forced to become reliant on European goods available in Melbourne for survival. Many groups engaged in the consumer economy of the city, bringing skins and rugs to sell. And historian Lynette Russell also notes the high levels of begging by Aboriginal people in Melbourne during the 19th century. In many ways, this was a way for the Kulin people to engage with settler economy, and while seen as begging by the settlers, was more likely seen as exchange by Aboriginal people. Russell argues that the begging was more than a mere opportunistic strategy for acquisition of money, food and other goods, and was instead perceived by the Kulin people as a viable, justifiable form of economic engagement, a kind of reciprocity for what they'd lost in terms of land. Russell highlights an example of an Aboriginal group asking a mining family for tea, thread and tobacco, calling the mother of the family countrywoman, and implying that as the family were now related to them via the land as kin, they, the traditional owners, were entitled to be provided with supplies. It was just a different way of thinking, really, and it was one that nuances of which were really escaped the European settlers. So my next story is kind of, I've possibly gone into too much detail because I just love this one so much. So the next story is actually about a Jewish family in Bendigo, neighbours of Amelia Turner, who had that pub that I was talking about. And they were deep in the thick of it with the daily realities of raising young children in the Gold Rush era, which I can relate to with raising my own young children. So Joseph Moody was a watchmaker, and with his wife Adelaide Isaacs, they were raising 5 children at their rented home in Forest Street when their cesspit was closed in 1873, in the first half of 1873, and they filled it with rubbish, just like in Melbourne. The fact that their home was rented is the first interesting thing here. They were both from London, and they were actually married here in Ballarat before heading over to Bendigo. I think it's worth noting here that Jewish people at this time couldn't own property in England. It seems that the Moody's invested in movable goods instead of property. So again, you kind of got different things going on for different people. The family became more successful, and although they had the means, the Moody's never purchased property, so they never go on to buy property. It's just something that they don't do. You know, the great Australian buy property thing, they didn't go there. But they did have this heightened emphasis on things, I think. It's a very humble workers' cottage next to the very humble pub that we looked at before. And surprisingly fancy goods were being discarded. And there's some slightly odd patterns there. There were very high numbers of matching sets, including matching toiletware, surpassing even the Melbourne high society family that I've looked at. So we're talking about really nice stuff in a really simple cottage. Where the Cornwalls had very few childhood-related things, the Moody's had an absolute overabundance. You're talking polar opposites here. I could go on forever about the childhood-related things that were in this cesspit. So they had these good boy, good girl monks. These are sort of part of that moralising China. You're trying to educate your children in how to behave. Also, the largest number of toys of any of the sites I've ever looked at. They had 35 toys, which is kind of quite a lot for that era. I would hate to count the toys in my children's room. It would be a lot more than 35. But in that era, 35 is quite a lot. That was more because my throat's getting dry than because I need a drink. They had matching toy tea sets, dolls, writing slates, anything and everything related to kids, they seem to have bought it. And then there's this little thing. This is a tiny thing that leads to quite a tragic story. And it had us, me and the team who works with me, it had us scratching our heads for a kind of a good afternoon before we kind of figured it out. And some Googling, I love Google, it's an archaeologist's best friend, turned up this. So it's basically like a little stopper for a baby feeder. And the same stoppers were also used on dummies and a few other kind of baby-related things. So, I mean, that tiny innocuous thing, this blew my mind. This was great. Yeah, so from this small object, we know now a whole lot about how this family was approaching raising their children, with all the latest modern goods and best available materials. There were also, interestingly, a very large number of medicine vials. So clearly someone in the family had been sick in that very short period, 6 months or so before that rubbish pit was filled. And it turns out that in the months prior to the cesspit being closed and filled, the Moody's 6-month-old daughter, Leah, had died. See, Pasteur's experiments in germ theory in the 1860s and 70s had yet to really take on. You know, they knew about germ theory, but it hadn't affected common practice in people's homes yet. And while these baby feeders offered much in the way of convenience, there was no concept yet of the importance of sterilising them. They later became known as death feeders. I mean, we don't know for sure that it was the baby feeder that was the cause of baby Leah's death, but then it could have been the teething syrup. Actually, where's the teething syrup gone? Uh-oh. There it is. Excellent. Oh, hang on. Yeah, no, that's right. So this one is a patent medicine advertised as soothing and quieting children. That sounds great. And babies, particularly teething babies. The syrup contained, of all things, morphine and alcohol. Excellent. And was likely responsible for the deaths of many children. Imagine that, giving your children morphine to quieten them down. It's terrifying. So it's highly possible that the Moody's overinvestment in their children and purchasing all the latest things for their kids had actually incredibly sadly resulted in the death of one of their daughters. So one of my team, Edwina Kay, has pondered on the connection between how Adelaide may have felt as a mother in a different society. As a Jewish woman, was she buying into the consumerism of childhood, all the latest toys, medicines, feeders, all these things, as a way of trying to fit in? Or at least maybe avoid being judged, you know? There's so much pressure around mothering today, it's very reasonable to expect that the same things were going on back then. And I think that this other object, which interestingly, I've got my slides out of order just to confuse myself, also kind of speaks to this a little bit. So these two bottles are something called Barry's Pearl Cream for beautifying the complexion and the skin. A single application removes wrinkles, freckles, sunburn and tan and turns the sallowest and darkest skin as pure as alabaster. So this is essentially skin whitening cream. That's what we're talking about here. So in terms of those desires to fit into society and again following that through to current society where skin whitening cream is a booming kind of consumer good in places like India. So, you know, from the Moody's, the stuff that they throw out is incredible and their story, I think, is really incredible. And you don't tend to think of the Jewish community as being a big one in the gold rush, but they're definitely here and they're definitely experiencing the gold rush in their own particular way. If I've got time, I've got one last, do I have time? Yeah? Okay, so at times, I kind of feel like there's a tendency to impose ideas of discrete communities onto Gold Rush era Victoria, as if the Jewish community or the Chinese community was entirely separate from the Anglo one. I'm sure lots of historians have done a great job at this, but sometimes you still, of not doing that, but sometimes it still feels like people want to compartmentalise things. Yes, there were immigration restrictions for Asian people during the gold rush and all the ideas and discriminations that went with it, but that doesn't mean that every person living in Victoria agreed with those policies and held those views. You only have to look at Littlelon to see how loose the boundaries between communities were. Our review of 100 histories in Littlelon revealed countless mixed marriages between all sorts of different groups. Take, for example, Edward Tepper. He was born to Irish parents, Irish again, and his mother had remarried to R. Gee of Littlelon, a businessman in Littlelon. Edward's aunt had also married a Chinese man, and the family had close business and family ties with the Chinese community in the area. Yes, it was hard to carve out a place in Victoria, and yes, Western consumer goods and clothing played a really important part. But archaeological work on the homes of Chinese people in the Gold Rush era has noted the uptake and adaptation of Western material goods. It's kind of a pattern that you see across a lot of archaeological sites. And of course, British goods dominated the market and undoubtedly played a role in pushing Western ideas and norms. But looking at the flip side of this, we also see a significant uptake of Chinese goods at homes of British and Irish people. Pretty much every rubbish pit that I've found from any of these families also contained Chinese goods. So you could also argue that consumerism bridged divides in this era. It's not something we really talk about quite as much. And the archaeology provides an opportunity to see interpersonal values and consumer behaviours. And one interpretation may well be that there was this significant blending of cultures on the ground between individuals. So in conclusion, in the the Gold Rush brought with it a reinvention of material lives in Victoria's cities. In the whirlwind of rapid change, status grew to be measured quite differently. Situation of birth, parentage and position on the social hierarchy were no longer the solid measure of a person. A new determiner of status had really strongly emerged, and that was, of course, stuff, things. Suddenly the clothes you wore, the things you purchased in your home became far more important. I think I found it quite interesting walking around Sovereign Hill with the kids today, and, you know, my brain is just going, okay, so you're a wealthy gentleman, you're a poor miner, you can see those distinctions in the way that people are presented, and Sovereign Hill really brings that to life so wonderfully. The lack of equality in a fluid and changing society drove consumerism to new heights. If you're that miner who's walking through town, perhaps if you make enough money and you can dress like the gentleman you've been seeing, perhaps you can pass yourself off and you know, pursue a successful life a bit more with a bit more vigour. So Melbourne's fashions and tastes became much grander, and increasing numbers moved into the middle class. It's like everyone was trying to outcompete each other and, you know, be the best turned out person on the street. In Bendigo, the archaeology suggests an even more heightened love of refined and beautiful things than in Melbourne, with far less of a gaudy edge. So in Melbourne, things get really colourful and really flashy and rather over the top and a touch tasteless. Whereas in Bendigo, it's expensive and quality and fancy, but it doesn't have that kind of gaudy twist to it. And sometimes I say these things, and it's like a sense you get from the archaeology rather than anything I can quantify into numbers for you. But basically what this means is, I think, that it really changed consumer culture permanently in Victoria. So going back to where we started this talk, how do we curb our wastefulness today when to a large extent what we consume still defines us? It's so integral, from everything from getting a job, making friends, finding a partner. It all depends to some extent on how we define ourselves through our things, the house we live in, the clothes we wear, the car we drive, all these sorts of things. Fitting in with your peers as much as anything. It's not necessarily about trying to be like someone else, but to fit in with your own cohort. Archaeology certainly doesn't have all the answers to our problems with excess consumerism, but it is a unique lens through which to engage with questions of sustainability. If we can gain insights into how people use things in status competition and identity formation in different parts of the world, there is a possibility to challenge ideas around the use of things and maybe change our approach to what we buy and what we consume. Encounters with waste in new and novel ways can challenge attitudes to throwaway culture. Confrontations with historic waste via archaeology, like the foyer display I showed you at the museum, might just provide the wake-up call that we all urgently need. And that's where I'll leave it, and hopefully I'm okay for time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reflection on sustainability and consumerism and how people have always been people. And I encourage all of us to reflect a little on what we're all taking away from that. That was a wonderful presentation, Sarah. Thank you. And I'd like to invite Dr. Ben Mountford from the Australian Catholic University, who's going to give a summation and ask questions. I encourage you to reflect whether you have something that you'd like to ask Sarah.
Thanks, Katrina. Hi, everyone. It's a great honour to be here tonight as Sovereign Hills Inspector of Nuisances is the role I'm working on. Just to say a few words in response to Sarah's fantastic lecture and to facilitate a few questions from you, the audience. Just before I do, I just wanted to say those of you who've been regular attendees to the Bate lecture over the last few years, you'll know that one of the great highlights of these nights was this moment when Weston would usually take the stage, regale us with his thoughts on the lecture, offer some comments to the speaker and some praise for what they'd done, and at least in my case, a bit of advice as what I still had left to do to finish off my lecture afterwards. But I think, for all of us here, Weston's passion for the history of the gold rushes, and especially for the history and heritage of goldfield cities like Bendigo and Ballarat, which was reflected so keenly, of course, in his long association here with Sovereign Hill, inspired us all. And I think really when you hear Sarah talk tonight, you get a sense of that inspiration she has from working on this topic and from exploring this world through her wonderful objects and through her cesspits. I just want to take one quick moment to read, if I can, just a couple of lines from Weston's great book on Victorian gold rushes. Anyone walking around the streets of Ballarat should not be without this in your top pocket if you walk around, just I think to give you a flavour of the way in which he really brought the gold rushes to life, as Sarah's done for us tonight. So this is the introduction to Weston's book on the gold rushes. The lure and power of gold is conveyed throughout the centuries in legends like those about King Midas, Jason's quest for the Golden Fleece, Inca treasure and the Spanish Main. This rare, heavy, lustrous metal helped to transform the Australian colonies in the latter half of the 19th century during what were also legendary times. For about 10 years, from 1849 in California and from 1851 in Victoria, alluvial gold deposits attracted migrations of people on a scale unheard of in world history. By then, economic and social tides flowing in Europe had swept away the barriers that in earlier centuries had restricted the gold seeking. Following the American and French revolutions of the late 18th century, democracy was on the march. It was possible as never before for ordinary people to join the search for the precious metal. Because Europe's deposits had long been exhausted for centuries, that search would take them on long journeys overseas, on ships that were larger, more numerous and more reliable than ever before. Anyone who found the gold rushes boring at school, I think, would contest it if they get a chance to read Weston. And in Sarah's fantastic lecture tonight, with its glimpses of this material world of the Golden Age that have come down to us through her archaeology of the cesspits and the objects that are left behind, we get a really privileged view, I think, onto the gold rushes that Weston worked so hard to better understand and to share with us. And what I also think Sarah's work does so wonderfully, as illustrated, of course, by this final slide, is to encourage us to rethink a bit the lessons that we take from the gold rush. There's many lessons that have been passed down in the gold rush for a long time. Sarah encourages, I think, to think more about what the gold rushes might tell us about our world of mass consumption, of showiness, and of our great wastefulness and love of things. Okay, I actually have the right to ask the first question, but what I might do is reserve that right, just because I want to make sure we give enough people a chance to ask a question, and I'll jump in if anyone needs a moment to think. But could I invite any questions from the floor for our speaker? Yeah, just up the back.
Do you find any garments in the cesspit?
I would love if we could excavate perfect dresses and waistcoats and things. Sadly, it basically doesn't happen. We find sad little bits of very, very decayed fabric. There was a rubbish pit at a draper shop which was full of pants, what looked like pants and a whole lot of shoes, but they're so degraded you can't really get much information from them, unfortunately. We get things like buttons and hooks and eyes and suspender fastenings and fun things like that, but very little by way of fabric. I think that draper pit, the one in the back of a draper shop, is the only example we've really had of clothing that still looked anything like clothing. Yeah. I would love if you could excavate gold rush dresses, but yeah.
What else? Jan.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just interested at what comes out when you're talking about things that people found, that the role of women is becoming much clearer and more enlightening. And this is a new way of looking. Everybody's always looking for ways that you can show what women, the presence of women on the gold field. And it was hard.
Yeah.
It's hard, but this is a really, to me, this is, I would like you to comment. It's a really interesting thing. You do see women coming out.
You do, yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting too, and I think that's where archaeology for me is so fun, and because you get what you get. And that can be incredibly frustrating. So there are those silences that I was talking about, and you just think, oh, I wish I could find that. But it also means that you get led in different ways, and you find out about, like, who would have ever written a history about Amelia Turner if it hadn't been for the rubbish excavated from the rubbish pit in her in the back of her pub. And it also does give you access to women as business owners in this, business operators. They had so few options. So someone who manages to run any kind of a business, a woman who runs a business, there were plenty of them, and they must have been up against it to make that work at all. And so I think starting from the ground, like, yeah, absolutely, it adds to the picture, and I'm definitely keen to keep thinking about different ways of building that picture, because there are still women that you don't get to see, like, for example, in terms of the sex workers, you see the madams, the women who are running it, but there's hardly anything about the women who were working there apart from the toothbrushes and the ointment jars. So yeah, it does give you access to people that you can't access necessarily through the historical record. Yeah, thanks.
Just at the front of the balcony there.
Obviously there are lots of other pits in this region. That's the actual mines themselves. Do you ever go looking in those, the abandoned shafts?
Yeah, one of the really, again, this is the joys and frustrations of archaeology. Mostly you don't get to go and dig the thing you want to dig. The excavations are, like 99% of excavations are done prior to development. So where a building goes up or a road goes through. So there have been some excavations of some industrial archaeology related to the goldfields where roads have gone in, and that's been really interesting. But in terms of excavating stuff that might be in mine shafts, it's something that doesn't tend to happen. Someone has to pay for it. And universities don't tend to pay, can't really foot the bill for that kind of stuff. It's developers who tend to foot the bill, and so it's compliance and they're forced to pay. Yeah, so not that I know of.
So who pays for digging up the cesspits then? It's only from that developer?
From the developers, yeah. So every time a building comes down and a new building goes up, if that's in an area that's been flagged as being archaeologically significant, an archaeological assessment has to be done, and if something significant is found, the developer has to fork up to pay for the excavation and the storage of the materials, and that's a lot of the material that's in Heritage Victoria and Museum Victoria. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, there was another question up this side. At the back. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah, for the presentation. As an archaeologist, could you comment on where people are interacting with the land? And I'm not talking about whether it's development or excavation or whatever, but where people are moving through a site and they see shards or items, albeit insignificant in appearance. What should people do if they see those items? Because they're part of the story of that former occupation.
Yeah.
People are all too often inclined to pick them up and take them away, and the story is lost.
Yes, absolutely.
What's the right thing to do?
Yeah.
If they appear to have significance, please.
Yeah, for sure. It's a really important question, and for anyone living around Bendigo and Ballarat, it's probably quite a common thing. Like we were in Melbourne just 2 weekends ago and wandering around the old mine sites. Like, oh, that's a 1870s gin bottle piece lying there. I left it there. I didn't touch it, I didn't move it, and I left it there. I think that's the hard line, is that you don't touch it. If you think something is really significant, probably the official thing to do would be to contact Heritage Victoria and see if it's... Heritage Victoria has a whole record of sites of significance and things that might be relevant. And so if it falls on one of the already registered sites, they might add that information to it. If you feel like you've seen something really significant and it's not registered with Heritage Victoria, then they may well start a process of nominating that place as and officially entering it in the register as a site. So there are legislated processes. My understanding is it's technically illegal to take anything from a site. Yeah, but it's an option. I mean, if everyone started emailing Heritage Victoria every time they find a piece of ceramic, that could potentially become problematic, I imagine. I don't imagine that would ever happen. But, you know, if you do feel like there's something, that's my daughter, hi, something significant, then, yeah, Heritage Victoria is probably the best place to head to.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, sorry, one at the back and then one up here, and then we'll probably...
Sarah, you mentioned a multicultural marriage with a lot of them, a couple of them, Irish and Chinese, and I've heard about those combinations here. What other combinations do you have?
As you can imagine, it's still kind of, there's not a huge... It gets more and more multicultural as time goes by, and most of the stuff we're looking at is 1870s. But we have like Prussian and Irish Catholic, or Chinese and Irish Catholic. The Jewish community was quite strong in Little On too. I didn't talk about that because, again, it's one of those frustrations of archaeology where we haven't got any archaeology related to any Jewish occupation, but there were lots of mixed marriages between Jewish people and English people and Irish people. So, yeah, it's kind of the full gamut of who was living in Little On, really. There were mixed marriages, yeah.
Thanks. We've got time just for one last question up the top.
Sarah, thanks for such an interesting talk. I was wondering whether it's been published anywhere or it's available.
Watch this space. I have drafts of chapters and I'm about to try and get a publisher, and it is very much, it's a book project, so all of these stories are going to form chapters in a book, and hopefully I will be getting that out just as soon as I can write it. Yeah. I hope that would be of interest.
Yes, I had, my great-great-grandfather had his first child in Little Monster.
Oh, wow.
In the 1850s.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Thanks, everyone. Just join me in thanking Sarah again.
Again, thank you again, Sarah, for what has obviously been a presentation that's hit them up with so many people to reflect on the hidden and not so hidden stories and the wonders to be found in a cesspit. Never would have thought I would find that so fascinating, of the layers that you can uncover. Now I'd like to invite Rosie Rowe, who's going to speak with us on behalf of the Bate family.
I know on behalf of Weston Bate I should have jumped on stage, as my mother has instructed me not to do that, I think, for OH&S. On behalf of the Bate family, from Mum, from Nicholas, from Christopher, from myself, and several other boys, 3 other boys that can't be here tonight, 3 other sons, we'd like to thank Sarah for a really interesting topic. I was reading it on the plane as I was coming back from Sydney today, and I was thinking, this is going to be fascinating. What's going to be brought to life from this topic? And I had a chance to talk to Sarah before the talk, to talk about what interested her in getting into this. And as she was speaking, I was thinking about what Dad would have loved. And thanks to Ben for bringing out some of the linkages to the gold rush. Dad would have thought that we should have an inspector of nuisances in the Globe right now. He would think that that would be a very good idea to have somebody launch across the globe and point a few people out. I know exactly who Dad would be thinking of in terms of that. I'm sure all of you do too. He would have very much loved the link that this topic had to people's values and people's priorities. And Dad was very much about not putting your sense of identity into your possessions, searching for identity and meaning in other ways, but certainly not that. And particularly the call that Sarah has perhaps given us about our own priorities and discarding what we discard, what will we leave in terms of our mark on the planet. He would have been very, very with you on that one. I think he also would have loved having an archaeologist here. I think the interdisciplinary work, the transdisciplinary work Dad loved, so he would have loved to have different people from different backgrounds bringing to life history, and that was the other thing that Dad would have loved. He would love Sarah's enthusiasm and her sense of stories. He used stories so well to work, I suppose, underneath what was on the paper or in the cesspits, and to think about the people and the stories. And that was his main thing, wasn't it? About bringing history alive. And Sarah, I think you've really done that tonight. So thank you very much from our family. This is such an important event for us to keep Weston Bate's memory alive. And thank you, Sarah, for being with us in 2019.
Thank you, Rosie, for representing the family with such meaning and connecting to us, to your family story. We really appreciate that you're able to be here with us tonight. Before we close tonight, I do want to say a few thanks. And I have Dr. Jane Grogan behind me, the hidden helper, here with us to just thank Dr. Sarah Hayes. I'd also like to thank Sarah's family. We know nobody does any of this work on our own, and the people that we bring with us are really important. So thank you to the whole Hayes family. We'd also like to say thank you to the Bate family and to Mrs. Janice Bate. In recognition of the work that Weston has supported at Sovereign Hill and the ongoing connection that you have to this place. Thank you, Janice. And I would also like to thank Vicky and Rebecca for connecting us to, as I said earlier, the intangible heritage, those threads that really tie us to the past and connect us together, that are so difficult to express except to capture in a moment. So thank you to Vicky and Rebecca. The wonderful thing at Sovereign Hill, we see people and the difference that possessions and the way we present ourselves really makes. I'd also like to thank, and this is a little surprise for Jan, I'd also like to thank the people behind the scenes who make an event like this possible. We know that what you see has been a glorious, wonderful evening connecting to the history of place, connecting to the stories of people, and these things take a lot of work to bring together. So I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking the whole team, but Jan, if you can just come out here and we can thank you. I've really enjoyed myself and I hope you have too, and I hope to see you back at Sovereign Hill connecting to this really special place. Thank you very much, and we'll see you another time.